Good morning, everybody watching on YouTube. We are gonna wait a moment or two for folks to kind of roll on in before we get started with the talk, but good morning and thank you for being here.
Good morning. Can you hear? Oh, you can hear me. Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna get us started so we can make sure we give everybody the time that's needed. Thanks everyone again for joining for the third seminar of Fish 513, Cultivating Inclusive Conservation Practices. I would like to start by thanking the university and the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences, in addition to the Campus Sustainability Fund, for making this seminar possible. If everybody is interested in following along with the readings that we've been doing previously, those are posted on the class website that is posted in the video description. And just as a note to folks, again, closed captions will not be added at the same time on this video, but they will be added later, probably tomorrow. So I'd like to start off with a land acknowledgement. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. I would also like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Duwamish people, who are the first people of Seattle. As in past weeks, I sort of added a personal reflection or a item that I've been working on in my own learning every week to this. And this week, my personal reflection and learning has been difficult, mostly because the topics that we'll cover today really highlight how raw and real the manifestations of racism, oppression, and marginalization can be. So my own work week has very conveniently focused on trying to strengthen collaborations and figure out how to maintain and trust your cooperators. And so my mind has been consumed by how to make conservation partnerships work when, in the case of many Indigenous groups in the US and Canada and around the world, there has been such a vast history of mistrust and atrocities. So today we'll hear a little bit about one example of how to do that work. And in order to avoid covering content that will be highlighted in the talk, I would encourage anyone who's watching to take the time to look at the course materials and look into the history of the discussion today. And I guess my rather weak but heartfelt reflection that stuck with me for several days has been that no progress can be made until people actually acknowledge and account for history, and to ask stakeholders to collaborate in a conservation project won't ever really work unless there's acknowledgement of the past. So to conceal and redirect that is to ask a victim basically to work with their abuser, and that situation will never be healthy or successful. So on that note, the seminar today has really stuck with me over the years since I saw Tara first give this talk about 2 years ago, and I know other people who watched that talk who have the same feeling. I'm really honored that our three speakers today are with us to share their experiences and knowledge. And I'd also like to just briefly add that the entire seminar that you've been watching so far exists because of this talk that Tara gave, and kind of got me thinking on this topic more. So to introduce our speakers, first off is Tara Chestnut. Tara Chestnut is an applied ecologist working on a host of field sampling, lab experiments, and modeling projects, primarily in Western North America. Her work investigates factors that influence species distributions, the ecology of pathogens and their hosts, ecological responses to environmental stressors such as contaminants and climate change, and endangered species recovery. In addition to her rigorous research program, she's a skilled science communicator and educator, so go find her on Twitter to hear more about what she's up to. Nettsie Bullchild is also joining us today. She is a Nisqually Tribal Historic Preservation Officer and works as the archives director, and has worked in that position at the tribe for 30 plus years in different departments. Nettsie is an enrolled member and elder of the Nisqually Indian tribe located in Olympia, Washington. On her mother's side, she is Nisqually, Cowlitz, and Hawaiian. And on her father's side, she is Tulalip, Scottish, from Hudson Bay, Scottish in sight. Her goal is for the Nisqually Indian tribe to pass on knowledge to the next generation through education, awareness, and to bring back their ancestors' traditional teachings. As a tribal historic preservation officer, her job is to preserve and protect tribal lands and sites on and off the reservation. As archives department director, her primary purpose is to collect culturally relevant materials, manage and maintain these collections, again, for the next generation. And we are also joined by Brad Beach. Brad also works for the Nisqually tribe. He studied archaeology and cultural anthropology at Oregon State University before beginning his tenure with the Nisqually Indian tribe. Brad has worked for the Nisqually since 2015, first as an archaeological monitor and currently as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. Brad assists the tribe in locating and preserving cultural and/or archaeological resources on the Nisqually Reservation and beyond throughout all the lands ceded by the Nisqually Indian tribe at the Treaty of Medicine Creek in 1854. With those introductions, I would like to welcome you all, and I will let you take it over for your talk. Thank you.
Thank you, and we're all really happy to be here. I appreciate the invitation, and I didn't realize that this talk allowed this seminar series to happen, and so I'm really glad to hear that, and grateful for your support. And so I'm going to talk today about the Washington Cascades Fisher Reintroduction Project, but I'm not going to talk about project updates, and rather we're going to address the planning process that occurred to get this project from concept to reality and highlight some of the steps our team took to ensure involvement of all of our co-managers in this conservation translocation project. I'd like to acknowledge my three co-principal investigators in this project, Jason Ransom, Dave Werntz, and Jeff Lewis, as well as the others that contributed to this talk, Hannah Anderson, Christy Palmentier, Hanford McLeod, Mark Nutzman, and Bill Ayal. And so biodiversity is essential to human well-being, but people have been reducing biodiversity throughout human history. And how the National Park Service fits into this is that it's the mission of the National Park Service to preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. Extinction has always been a feature of life on Earth, but the domination of global ecosystems by people has caused a sharp rise in the rate of extinctions to far above pre-human levels. Here we see the cumulative extinction of mammal genera over the past 60,000 years on the upper right, or upper left, I'm sorry. The cumulative extinction of vertebrates in New Zealand over the last 1,000 years, the cumulative extinction of vertebrates worldwide over the last 500 years, and recent trends in the percent of species threatened in birds, mammals, and amphibians assessed using criteria established by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or the IUCN. Our knowledge of current threats suggests that the rate of extinction could soon rise to at least 5 times higher than it has been in the past. And we know that all species are connected to others through ecological interactions. Extinctions therefore reverberate through ecosystems, as do extirpations of local populations and declines in abundance. And so how do we know biodiversity losses are occurring? Long-term population monitoring programs provide vital information on trends in species and community composition over time. Well-known examples of early community-based science projects include the Breeding Bird Survey and Christmas Bird Count. These Breeding Bird Survey maps provide estimates of population change for a species over its range, and areas in increase are in blue, and areas, excuse me, of decline are in red. We can also quantify range changes using model probabilities of detection and occupancy for a species. This example from the Grinnell Resurvey project documents shifts in the elevational range limits of the montane shrew in California, which were detected by comparing historic and modern observations. Hunting and trapping records have been used to qualitatively estimate the commonness of fur bearers and introduced predators. And traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous knowledge of natural resources provides information about species' natural history, abundance, distribution, and phenological shifts. And so what are the main causes of current biodiversity losses? Well, the short answer is people. As human populations have grown and Europeans colonized the globe, natural lands have been disturbed and fragmented. Plants and animals have been exploited and overharvested. Globalization has led to the introduction of exotic species to new landscapes, and industrialization has caused the climate to rapidly change. In an effort to abate these threats, humans have established protected areas such as national parks and implemented policies with varied successes to reduce the spread of invasive species, reduce carbon emissions, restore forests, and encourage the sustainable use of resources.
Hey, Tara.
Several international initiatives have attempted to coordinate. Yeah.
I think there's a bit of a lag between the slides and the audio. Do you think you can try turning off your video and maybe that will help with speed?
I can.
We'll see if that helps.
Stop video. How is that?
I think it's speeding up. Plug ahead and we will check back in.
Several international initiatives have attempted to coordinate action to halt or reverse biodiversity losses with ambitious goals to reduce the loss of species and natural habitats, safeguarding ecosystem services while also improving planning, financing, knowledge, and benefits from sustainable management of the natural world. Introduced predators have been successfully removed from islands. Reintroductions and habitat restoration have improved the status of some critically endangered species. And areas with key ecosystem functions have been identified to aid in restoration and restrict development, as this example in China shows. Reintroductions and conservation translocations are a widely used restoration tool, and the IUCN has developed guidelines to inform these types of projects. These guidelines include standardized definitions of language for translocation spectrums, such as introduction, reintroduction, and restoration. And the IUCN guidelines provide guidance to assist with identifying a problem that may be solved by translocation, conducting risk and feasibility assessments, and if warranted, implementation of a translocation project. The Conservation Translocation Project we're going to highlight today, the Washington Cascades Fisher Reintroduction Project, use these guidelines. And the focus of the rest of my talk will be on the implementation phase and our coordination with tribes and First Nations. And I'd like to acknowledge that the story I'm about to tell includes sharing experiences of intergenerational trauma that was reviewed and approved by my tribal co-authors, not for their benefit, but for your benefit, so that you can have a greater depth of understanding of the Indigenous perspectives related to conservation. So fishers were extirpated from Washington state in the early to mid 1900s. The cause of extirpation is primarily attributed to overharvest for fur during the Great Depression, when a trapper could earn enough to support themselves and their family for a year with just a few pelts. The only fur bearers in North America that had a higher price at the time were sea otters and fur seals. And while this explanation for extirpation is technically true, it's not the whole truth. And it's a rather sanitized explanation that fails to recognize the legacy of European colonization and violence that occurred in regards to Indigenous rights and sovereignty, and the lasting effects of colonialism that still exist today. I'm not going to delve into that history or those legacies here, but a great resource to review for folks if you are engaged with Twitter is to head on over and check out Asia Murphy's thread on that's titled Blood Parks. It summarizes wildlife management course that she teaches at Penn State University that's focused on this subject from a global perspective. So to orient you to the project area, I'll be referring to this partial map of North America by Aaron Carpella, which you can find on his website, tribalnationsmaps.com. Some of the communities on this map are signatories to treaties with the United States and Canada, which may or may not define usual and accustomed traditional use areas. And some of these communities hold claim to Aboriginal land title. The geographic scope of the Washington Cascades Fisher Reintroduction Project includes Western Washington State in the United States, Central British Columbia, and Alberta, Canada. And today I'll highlight the first release at Mount Rainier National Park, where fisher translocations occurred from the traditional lands of the Chilcotin, Carrier, and Shuswap nations in British Columbia to the Southern Washington Cascades and the traditional lands of the Nisqually, Cowlitz, Puyallup, Muckleshoot, Squaxin Island, and Yakima nations in Washington. So from inception to implementation, the Washington Cascades Fisher Reintroduction Project took nearly 20 years of planning. The mechanism that got all of this started was that the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife, or WDFW, listed the fisher as an endangered species back in 1998. In 2004, WDFW published a recovery plan which concluded that reintroduction was the best way to restore fisher to Washington State. And we conducted a feasibility assessment which identified the Cascade and Olympic ranges as the regions for restoration actions, with British Columbia and Alberta as ideal source populations because of the genetic similarity to the fishers that once occurred here. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service also listed the West Coast fisher population as a candidate for federal protection under the Endangered Species Act. And fisher restoration in Washington began in 2008 on the Olympic Peninsula. And in 2013, we prepared an implementation plan for reintroducing fisher to the Washington Cascades with the goal of beginning releases in 2014. In a government-to-government process, the National Park Service initiated tribal consultation at our annual tribal meeting at Mount Rainier with the 6 tribes that are affiliated with the park. We also followed a broader tribal consultation process through the State Historic Preservation Office, which seeks input from the public and Native American tribes with the purpose of protecting important historic sites. And so through the State Historic Preservation Office, we also sent letters of intent to the British Columbia Aboriginal Fisheries Commission, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and 11 additional Washington tribes. 6 months before the first fisher releases were planned to occur, the Supreme Court of Canada granted the Chilcotin Nation a declaration of Aboriginal land title to a defined area located within our trapping area in British Columbia. And as title holder, the Chilcotin Nation determines the use and controls access to these declared tidal lands. This was the first time in Canada Aboriginal land title had been confirmed outside of an Indian reserve. Not only did that have ramifications for British Columbia, a province that is blanketed by unresolved land claims, the decision set a precedent for future claims of Aboriginal land title throughout the country. It also meant that our project needed to go through the Chilcotin Nation environmental review process, which was yet to be defined. The planned fisher releases in winter 2014 were postponed to allow for time for this environmental review. In some cases, environmental review processes can take several years to document the natural and cultural resources present and the potential impacts of a proposed action may have to these resources, and also to identify ways to minimize these impacts. And so there was a lot of uncertainty in how long this project would be postponed. And so this is Christy Palmentier. She is a First Nations liaison from the British Columbian government who was assigned to help our project, she was assigned to our project to help facilitate communication. And Christy is also a member of the Shuswap Nation. And so about a year after the landmark court decision, Christy delivered the good news that the Chilcotin Nation approved our project and that we had about a month to mobilize before the trapping season began, which was a huge undertaking. And so we had a conversation where I asked her opinion about how she felt the environmental review process worked, and if people were happy and satisfied with the outcome. And she said that the Chilcotin Nation was happy, but after some deeper conversations, she revealed that there appeared to be some apprehension among tribal elders that was not captured by the environmental review process. And she said that she couldn't convey what those specific concerns were, but we began brainstorming ideas to try to address and alleviate some of those concerns. And so I'll be honest, there was some initial apprehension among some of our team members to re-engage with the Chilcotin Nation because of uncertainty in the process and concern that we could be reinitiating consultation that could result in the approval of the project being revoked. And so despite these worries, I worked closely with Christy to have further conversations with the Chilcotin, Shuswap, and Carrier Nation leadership. And based on their feedback, we planned a First Nations escort where we brought the animals down from our facility in Williams Lake, British Columbia, with First Nations escorts. We hosted a release event that included all of the park affiliated tribes and facilitated a private ceremony between the three First Nations and Nisqually tribal members so that the First Nations could transfer stewardship of the fisher to the Nisqually tribe. And we also gained permission from the Nisqually tribe to release the animals in an area of the park that is designated for exclusive use by Nisqually tribal members only. And one of the supplemental materials that we shared was a video of what this event looked like. And so if you haven't already watched it, I encourage you to do so right after the seminar. And so I said that Christy told me that she couldn't convey what the First Nations elders' concerns were. Well, I interpreted that to mean that she didn't know what the specific concerns were, but what she meant was that it wasn't her business to be discussing. She was a Shuswap Nation member, not a Chilcotin Nation member, and that she couldn't represent the Chilcotin Nation's elders' concerns without being asked to. And so this is Loretta Williams, whose father, Chief William, initiated the Chilcotin Nation title lawsuit in British Columbia. And so after this private ceremony steeled her, Loretta read a statement from the Chilcotin Nation tribal elders that took us back to 1981. And I'm guessing that there are several people that are here now that were alive in 1981. And some of you may be school-aged, may have been school-aged at that time. So 1981 was the year that the Caribou Indian Residential School was finally closed. And so for those of you that are not familiar with residential schools, the name is an absolute misnomer. Residential schools were open throughout the US, Canada, Australia, and other places where European colonized. Indigenous children were taken from their families, abused, and assimilated. Women and girls were sterilized without their knowledge. And a question is like, how many schools do you know of that have graveyards? Many residential schools did, including the Caribou Indian Residential School. This facility was in operation for 90 years in Williams Lake, British Columbia, where most of the people from the Chilcotin, Shuswap, and Carrier First Nations currently live. Loretta conveyed that the elders had no qualms with the trapping, and in fact, many of the trappers working on our project were First Nations members who were making their living as fur trappers, so they were uniquely qualified to lend their expertise to our restoration project. The concern that Christy could not convey and the elders asked Loretta to share was that although they approved of our project, it left them feeling unsettled because they felt like their Fisher family members were being forcibly removed from their homes and taken to a place with no family to look after them. And for the elders, our project, our translocation project, was no different than their own experiences of being removed from their family homes and being forced by the government into assimilation schools. It also reminded them of the large numbers of Native children who were separated from their parents, extended families, and communities by state child welfare and private adoption agencies, and the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Because of the trust that we cultivated through Christy, the Chilcotin Nation elders asked Loretta to share this story, and specifically that by facilitating the connection with the Nisqually tribe, they felt great peace of mind that the Fishers would be looked after by family. They also conveyed the importance that their youth had on influencing their decision to ultimately approve the project, as the young people saw this project as an opportunity for their elders to heal both themselves and the Fishers in Washington state. When I tell this story, I do so with great humility because it reveals a lot about my own naivety and lack of deep understanding about the Indigenous people who are my neighbors and whose land I live on, and how much more I need to learn. I've had training in government relations and collaborated with tribes to conduct surveys for species that we co-manage. And I knew that there was a lot that I didn't know, but I was fully unprepared for the fact that a conservation project that, from my perspective as a non-Indigenous ecologist and a natural resource manager, it was a happy conservation success story. But I was unprepared for the fact that it could cause people to relive their individual and intergenerational trauma. And I'm so grateful that it also created an opportunity for their healing. I feel fairly certain that we will be successful in meeting our primary goal to restore Fisher to the landscape in Washington. And I feel absolutely certain that part of our success will be due to the way that we approach the uncertainty of a new consultation process, and hopefully demonstrated to First Nations and tribal leaders that we value more than just science. Thank you for allowing me to share this story.
Thank you so much, Tara. That is yeah, I think that's really powerful. I think we are going to have a really great conversation about all of this. I just want to start off by thanking you. I wish that you could hear the number of applauses that are happening, but we live in the virtual world now, so that's challenging. And I would like to take the opportunity to open it up to the YouTube channel for any folks that are watching. If you have questions, we have time to be able to answer a few of those. So you can type them into the YouTube live chat and I can ask them and answer them there. In the meantime, I will get us started with one. I think a lot of conversations that we've had in this class so far have really revolved around people feeling fairly powerless to do this sort of meaningful work that you just described, Tara, things that actually confront really difficult topics and actually try and come up with novel solutions that truly are more inclusive. I'm wondering, you know, were the pathways already sort of there with your group and Mount Rainier, or how much did you actually have to create these solutions and these pathways to have these conversations?
That's a good question. And I think Nettsie has been involved with these types of conversations for far longer than I have, and may have some perspectives on sort of the long game.
Yeah, Nettsie, if you would like to add, you should feel free.
Well, really, the whole process that has to happen has always been, and we've been fighting for this for years, is tribal consultation. You know, there's always been the laws with the government to government, with the Centennial Accord, but it's actually getting tribes involved. And kind of what I feel Tara's learning experience is something that we have always looked at. It's always hard to get elders to express themselves because for years, because of boarding school, because of all these other, or their residential, as they're called, our elders were kept silent. And so the next generation weren't allowed to learn things or get things passed down to them traditionally. And so in that process, there's always just been this silence. So when some of these, like, you know, with this project happening with Tara, there was a lot of learning on both sides because, you know, for my generation, my mom's generation, there was no talk about it. You know, there was never this issue. Like I was just telling my coworker, Brad, I go, we really didn't know what a fisher was because in our time, we had never seen this, you know, so reintroducing was an experience for us too. And then researching of why this was important, you know, so not just for the fisher, but for everything else. So you can understand how the First Nation, you know, in British Columbia, how they feel because it's happened to us on, you know, the United States also. So there's just really not a lot of talk, a lot of knowledge on what it takes to introduce these projects until you really sit down with the tribe and get that background, you know, that feeling of why don't you want this to happen or why is it so hard to do this? But those feelings do come back up, you know, when you're forced out of your home, and we get a lot of that here. So there's just, it, like I tell people, it's really uncomfortable for elders to talk about it, but you understand that. And then we get into this, the cultural, the scientific, you know, so the two are trying to come together, but it's just a long process.
Awesome. That is a great answer. I think that gives us some really important insight. Did Tara or Brad, did you have anything else to add to that?
I think that at least in this particular situation, having Christy Palmentier as our liaison was a really important part of just facilitating conversations, because she was an employee of the British Columbian government, so she was serving in a role as a government liaison, but also facilitating conversations between essentially the Canadian government, the provincial government, the state government here, the federal government in the US, plus 3 First Nations. It took a lot of nuance and a lot of code switching on her part. And I think that without her, we wouldn't have been able to make the same kind of we wouldn't have been able to have the same kind of access, because the trust, I think the level of trust wasn't there, and that she really helped cultivate that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was just going to add to that. Brad, did you have anything to add?
I was just going to say, and then with National Parks and Mount Rainier, they've, at least for my time with Nisqually, Mount Rainier's always done a really great job of putting consultation in really the early stages of projects, and keeping the tribe engaged. It's been really helpful working with the National Park Service and Mount Rainier from an early stage, keeping everyone involved, everyone knowledgeable, so there's no miscommunication or missteps along the way.
Yeah, that's a great point. I was going to say, with my own reading, that kind of comes back again and again, that you can't really do this work meaningfully if you're doing it poorly planned out or organized without the logistical considerations. I think one of the questions I've seen a lot, especially from those of us who are coming from a university side of things, is oftentimes at the graduate student level or the postdoc level, we get a project that's already sort of been designed, and we just get told, this will be your role. Are there, I don't know if any of you can kind of speak to this, but are there pathways for younger or lower in the ranking people to actually kind of push a project to be more responsive and be more engaged with their stakeholders if their PI is resistant to that? It's a big question. Sorry, I'm asking the easy to answer questions now.
Yeah,
I think just from my experiences, I think that one of the most important things is to spend time doing the work and establishing relationships without asking for anything. That if you come into a community as an outsider and ask people to do work for you, there's that's a big challenge, and part of that work is even like becoming, investing time and resources in getting to know you, and that that can be a big challenge. And so I think one of the things that I've just done personally is when there's opportunity to just show up and be present, I do. And so going to events and volunteering to support like the canoe journey is something that I've done, and going on the Leshai walk, the honor walk, and being present in ways that are outside of my own work is something just for me personally I've invested in, because I want to demonstrate that I'm there, not just for the things that I need, but in a larger way. And I think as a student, if you're working on a project that's 2 or 3 years long, it's hard to establish those relationships.
Yeah, from my point of view, tribally, working up to that is we've gone to different agencies, groups, and explain some of the things from the Nisqually tribe. But what we want people to remember is all tribal governments are not run the same. So the biggest thing for consultants is to really research the tribe, and a lot of tribes have websites now. We always refer for Nisqually, we refer people to Cecilia Carpenter because she was our historian and she has written several books. And so I usually tell people, go look at her, read her books, look at her research, then come back with questions that you have. But it's understanding all tribes have different governments. So if you work with one tribe and think, oh, this was easy, it might not be the same for the next tribe because of the way their structure is. And some do have what we call tribal elder, not committees, but a lot of times they have this last say. So sometimes you have to get through that part of it also. So that's what I tell people, really do your research on a tribe before you kind of want to work with them or consult with them, get all that out first. And we're working with UW on, trying to change that also. We work with Burke to try to get that changed also. Like some of the conceptions that they thought were, they're not that way, because like with the Burke Museum, we've had to point out to them, everything in there is living to us. It's a living entity that needs care, so they're trying to see it from our point of view.
Yeah, I think those are both really, really tangible points to act on, which I think is nice. We've been having a lot of conversations without examples per se of the successes, so it's good to kind of hear that insight. Brad, did you have anything to add to that?
Oh no, so I was just answering a chat question really quick.
Oh, no worries. Yeah.
I had one more. I think one more point to add, Stacy, is that I think it's also important to have reasonable expectations about access. And that also goes back to Nettsie's point of like knowing who you're working with and that each government is different. And so when we were starting to release fishers, they had transmitters that last for 2 to 3 years, and so we're tracking them all over the landscape. And so as we had evidence of denning or as we had mortalities that we wanted to recover, it was really important to make sure that we knew really in advance what reasonable expectations might be for access to land. And so if there was, say, a dead fisher that I wanted to recover that was on a reservation, I had a pretty good sense of what that was going to look like. And so I knew not to even ask some of our tribal partners for direct access because those were sacred sites. And that if I wanted to get that fisher back, what that was going to look like is essentially me providing training on the telemetry work that we did and whether they had time, interest, or wanted to recover that animal and return it to us was really up to them. And so I think because we approached it with eyes wide open and had previous relationships established, we were able to be more effective in our expectations of access to land and sacred sites.
Yeah, that is a great point. I think sometimes as scientists, we have a hard time hearing no. So I guess it's good also to just be very aware of what you can and can't do and to have had those conversations very clearly. Yeah, so I am going to move to the class portion and shut down the video, but is there anything else any of you would like to add to the broader YouTube verse before we go to just the class? Awesome. Well, I want to take one more opportunity to thank the three of you for coming into the seminar and sharing. I also want to take the opportunity to thank everybody who's on the YouTube live chat and also who's been watching. And we will have future seminars, so stay tuned. And yeah, have a good one, everybody out there in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you.